He put a Roman tax collector and a sworn enemy of Rome in the same room and called them both his own. Picture the moment. Matthew, a toll collector who worked under Roman economic authority, who had effectively sold his loyalty to the empire, who was so socially excommunicated that his own people considered him dead. And Simon, designated in every gospel list as the Zealot, a title that in first-century Judea did not mean enthusiastic. It meant politically radicalized. It meant someone who believed Roman collaboration was not just wrong, it was punishable. These two men did not belong in the same room. In any other context, in any other movement, their presence at the same table would have ended in violence. And yet, there they are, side by side in the apostolic roll call, called by the same rabbi, sent on the same mission, which raises a question most readers walk straight past. What kind of teacher deliberately assembles a group like this? And what was the act of choosing these 12 specific men actually announcing to the world? Here is the assumption most readers bring to the Gospels. Jesus needed helpers. He was launching a movement, and like any founder, he recruited capable people. Fishermen with work ethic, a tax collector with financial acumen, a zealot with passion. The 12 in this reading are a leadership team, a ministry staff, gifted individuals chosen for their usefulness. The text does not support this. Look at what the Gospels actually preserve. There are 4 distinct lists of the 12. In Matthew chapter 10, Mark chapter 3, Luke chapter 6, and Acts chapter 1. Read them side by side and something immediately stands out. The names shift slightly. Thaddeus in Matthew and Mark becomes Judas, son of James, in Luke and Acts. But one thing never shifts. Not once, across any list, in any gospel. The number, always 12. Not 11 when one proves difficult. Not 13 when the movement grows. Always, exactly, 12. And if you are a first-century Jewish reader, which every original audience of these texts was, that number does not sound like a staffing decision. It sounds like a declaration, because 12 is not a neutral number in Israel's story. It is the number of the sons of Jacob, the number of the tribes, the number that, in the Hebrew imagination, meant the people of God in their completeness. And by the 1st century, that completeness was a wound. 10 of the 12 tribes had been swallowed by Assyrian exiles centuries earlier. The tribal structure was a memory, a longing, a promise not yet fulfilled. The 12-tribe nation existed in the past, and in the hope of a future restoration. What Jesus was doing when he called exactly 12 men around himself was not building a church staff. He was making a claim, a structural, symbolic, inescapable claim that the restoration Israel had been waiting for was beginning, not through a military campaign, not through a political party, through him and through the 12 men he placed at his table. The disciples' contradictions, their obscurity, their impossible combinations, those were not problems to solve. They were features of the announcement. But to understand what that announcement actually meant, we need to look at who these men were. Start with the fishermen, because they are the ones most people think they understand. Peter, Andrew, James, and John worked the Sea of Galilee, and the instinct is to picture them as simple laborers. That picture is not quite right. Commercial fishing in first-century Galilee required business partnerships, seasonal knowledge, management of hired hands, and enough financial literacy to operate within a regional trade economy. The sons of Zebedee had hired servants. These were not destitute men. They were working-class tradespeople, economically embedded, almost certainly literate in Aramaic, and familiar with the Hebrew scriptures read in their local synagogue. Matthew is a different story. Picture the toll booth itself, a fixed post on a trade road, a table, a man with a ledger, collecting duties on goods moving through. The Greek word for his occupation is telones, someone who purchased the right to collect customs duties, keeping a profit margin. To his Jewish neighbors, this made him functionally a traitor. The rabbis classified toll collectors with robbers. His social excommunication was not informal, it was structural. When Jesus called Matthew, he was not just inviting an unpopular man. He was reaching across a defined boundary in full public view at that table. Simon the Zealot carries a designation, ho zelotes in Greek, that scholars debate but cannot dismiss. Whether Simon was formally affiliated with the nationalist movement that would eventually ignite the Jewish revolt of 66 AD, or simply marked by intense political piety, the title signals a man whose commitments ran deep. Sitting across a table from Matthew would not have been neutral for him. Then there are the ones the Gospels barely mention. Philip, Bartholomew, Thaddeus, James, son of Alphaeus, they appear in the lists and almost nowhere else. No miracles attributed to them, no recorded teachings, no dramatic failures. Their obscurity is itself a data point. Jesus did not choose these men because they were extraordinary. He chose 12 because the number was the point. Now notice what the martyrdom traditions do and do not tell us. 2 deaths are anchored in primary sources. James, son of Zebedee, was executed by Herod Agrippa, that is in Acts 12, not tradition text. Peter's death by crucifixion in Rome is attested early, by Clement of Rome and later church historians, and matches the trajectory Jesus predicts for him in John 21:18-19. But follow the trail further. Thomas in India, Matthew in Ethiopia, Bartholomew in Armenia, and the sources thin and diversify. Some are credible, some are legendary. That distinction matters. The traditions deserve honest hands, neither dismissed nor inflated, because the men themselves were real enough to generate them. So now you know who these men were, their trades, their politics, their silences. What you do not yet know is what the text itself is doing when it records their names. Because the 4 lists of the 12 are not simple rosters. They have a structure, a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot read those lists the same way again. Notice what happens when you lay all 4 apostolic lists side by side: Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts. And look not just at who is named, but at how the names are arranged. Every list organizes the 12 into 3 groups of 4. This is not accidental formatting. It is a consistent structural pattern across independent documents. And within each group, the same name always leads. Peter opens the first group of 4 in every single list. Philip opens the second group of 4 in every single list. James, son of Alphaeus, opens the third group of 4 in every single list. The internal order within each cluster shifts, but the anchor names do not move. Think about what that means for transmission. A community reciting these names, or a scribe copying them onto a new scroll, was not working from a staff directory. They were preserving a fixed tripartite structure, a deliberate literary and communal device for encoding the group's identity into a memorizable form. That is not how you record personnel. That is how you carry a symbolic claim across generations. Now look at the language Jesus uses in Matthew chapter 19. A rich young man has just walked away, and Peter asks what those who have left everything will receive. Jesus answers with a specific word, palingenesia, translated in most English Bibles as renewal or regeneration. But the word is more precise than that. Palingenesia means the reconstitution of something that once existed, the restoration of a prior order. And Jesus places it in a specific future context. When the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, the 12 will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 thrones, 12 tribes. The structural echo is not subtle. The Greek word for the 12 used throughout the Gospels, hoi dodeka, functions as a title, not just a count. It appears without explanation, as though the audience already understands what it means. Because in the Jewish symbolic world, they did. 12 meant the full people of God. Choosing 12 was an act of living symbolism, a walking, breathing claim that the scattered, fractured, exiled people were being gathered again. What are you looking at when you read those 4 lists? You are looking at a claim encoded in structure. The 12 were not chosen despite their contradictions. They were chosen to embody the full range of Israel, its conflicts, its losses, its impossible hope of unity, in a single visible community gathered around one teacher. That is what a list of names is doing. That is what the number has always been doing. And the implications of that reach much further than most readers ever follow them. Here is the question that changes everything. If the number 12 was a declaration, not a staffing decision, why these 12? Why a tax collector sitting next to a nationalist? Why fishermen and not scribes? Why so many men the Gospels themselves barely bother to name? The answer is older than the Gospels, and it changes what you see every time you read a calling account. Go back to Genesis. 12 sons of Jacob, each one the head of a tribe, each tribe a piece of the covenant nation that would become Israel. That tribal structure was not administrative convenience. It was the theological skeleton of the people of God. 12 tribes meant one complete nation under covenant, and every literate Jewish reader in the first century knew that number by heart. But by the time Jesus was teaching in Galilee, that skeleton was broken. The Assyrian Empire had swallowed 10 of the 12 tribes centuries earlier. They did not return. The tribal system was, by the first century, a wound, a memory of wholeness, and a promise of restoration not yet fulfilled. The prophets had spoken of a day when the scattered would be gathered, when the 12 would be whole again. Jesus chose 12 men at that precise moment of longing. Not 11, not 13, 12. And the number was the announcement. He was claiming to be the center around which the fractured nation was being gathered again. Matthew 19:28 makes the typological logic explicit. Jesus tells the 12, "At the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." 12 thrones, 12 tribes. That is not metaphor. That is Jesus naming what the selection of the 12 has always been doing. And Acts 1 confirms it. When Judas dies, the early community does not continue as 11. They restore the number to 12 before Pentecost, before any further action. The symbolic completeness was not negotiable. This is what the act of choosing 12 was announcing to the world. Not a new religion, not a reform movement, a reconstitution, the gathering of a scattered people around a new center. The rabbi who called Matthew and Simon was not tolerating their contradictions. He was making them the raw material of a new Israel, one held together not by political agreement but by a shared call. Not human compatibility holding the center, a person holding the center. But if that reframes what Jesus was doing, it also reframes something modern readers almost always miss. The individual calling accounts. The moment Jesus walks up to a fishing boat, the moment he stops at a tax booth. Those scenes are not just stories about two men saying yes. They are something much larger, and we need to see it. Every calling account in the Gospels gets read the same way. Jesus appears. He issues an invitation. The person leaves everything and follows. We read it as biography, a snapshot of two lives changing direction. And that reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that costs us something significant. The calling accounts are not primarily about the individuals being called. They are about what kind of kingdom is being assembled and who gets included in it. Consider what the text actually shows us. Jesus does not call 12 men from the same village, the same profession, or the same political conviction. He calls from opposite ends of the social and ideological spectrum and places them at the same table. Matthew was a tax collector, a Roman collaborator, economically prosperous, socially despised by his own people. Simon the Zealot was, by definition, committed to the violent overthrow of Roman occupation. Under any ordinary social logic, these two men should never have shared a meal, let alone a mission. The calling accounts do not explain how that tension was resolved. They do not offer a reconciliation scene. They simply report that both men were called. and that both men came. That silence is the point. The gospel writers are not glossing over the contradiction. They are presenting it as evidence. The kingdom Jesus was building was not one where everyone agreed before they joined. It was one where the call itself was the unifying force, prior to and more powerful than every division the world had constructed. This reframes what it means to read your own calling. The question the Gospels are asking is not, are you qualified? Are you consistent? Are you free of contradiction? The question is, did you hear the call, and did you come? Matthew brought his compromises. Simon brought his convictions. Neither man was asked to resolve himself before he followed. The resolution, to whatever extent it came, happened in the following. The calling accounts are not portraits of exceptional people. They are evidence of an exceptional kingdom, one whose unity was not built on human compatibility, but on something else entirely. Which brings us back to the beginning, and to the two men who have been sitting at the edge of this conversation since the first frame, Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector. We introduce them at the start as the most improbable pairing in the New Testament. A Roman collaborator and a revolutionary, listed one after the other in every gospel account, without explanation, without commentary, without apology. Now we can see what that pairing was doing. It was not an accident of history. It was not an oversight by the gospel writers. It was a structural declaration, placed in the list, repeated across all four gospels, preserved precisely because the early church understood what it meant. Jesus did not choose 12 disciples despite their contradictions. He chose 12 because their contradictions announced what kind of kingdom he was building. A kingdom that does not require you to resolve yourself before you enter it. A kingdom where the call comes before the transformation, not after. A kingdom that can hold people together who have no business being in the same room, because the center is not a shared ideology. The center is a person. That is the resonant truth underneath everything we have covered today. The number 12 was not logistical. It was typological, a living announcement that the scattered people of God were being gathered again. The lists were not random. They were structured to show that the 12 were not a committee. They were a new Israel, assembled around a new center. And the calling accounts were not just biography. They were evidence that the kingdom's unity was not built on human compatibility. So here is the question worth sitting with. When you read a calling account in the Gospels, what do you see? A story about someone else, in another century, in a world that no longer exists? Or a structural argument about what kind of community you have been invited into? Because if the disciples were chosen with their contradictions intact, if Matthew and Simon sat at the same table not because they agreed, but because they were both called, then the invitation extended to you carries the same terms. You do not need to be resolved. You need to respond. If this kind of close reading of the Gospels is something you want more of, subscribe. There is a great deal more to uncover. And if you know someone who has ever felt that their contradictions place them outside the kingdom, send them this video. The list of the 12 was written for exactly that person.